Hello, everyone. This is Tom Fox back for another episode, and we are absolutely thrilled today to have Dr. Amy Jadesimi. I know I butchered that. Sorry, joining us today. So, with that, Lola, I'm going to pitch it over to you.
Thank you, Tom, and welcome to the Ethics First podcast, Dr. Amy. It's such a pleasure. It's an absolute pleasure to have you here. And for me personally, actually, it's a double delight to be in this pod room, this virtual pod room with two of the Ethics First Advisory Committee members, and that's our dear host, Tom, and with yourself. So, welcome to the Ethics First podcast.
Thank you. Thank you for including me. It's an absolute honor. Thank you.
Excellent. So, your profile is where I want to start. I think it's very relevant to the conversation we're going to be having today about ethics first. So, let's introduce you, but I do want you to inspire us some more, as if your profile is not already inspiring. You go from being a graduate of medicine at Oxford University, and then you go on to have an MBA, and then you prove yourself as a business person, setting up a very much needed organization in a country that's quite tricky to do business in, Nigeria, and also in a very high risk sector. And you've done a successful job of that over the years. So let's talk about your background a little bit. Why don't you just inspire us? I know you give a lot of talks about your background and advise young people on how to think about their career. So let me just make you do that again for the next few minutes as you introduce yourself.
No problem. Good afternoon, everybody. So I am Amy Jadesimi. I did graduate with a medical doctorate from Oxford, but I actually went into banking in the City of London after that. I was at Goldman Sachs for about 3 years. And then I did my MBA in Stanford, which wasn't a popular, I mean, it was the right choice for me. It wasn't a popular choice. Most people and that time really only knew about Harvard and everything. But Stanford was the right place for me, partly because it was very entrepreneurial and it was far out of my comfort zone. And I learned a lot of things there that I've now applied to my life in Nigeria. So after the MBA, I actually planned to go back into banking or maybe private equity or VC. But I came to visit Nigeria because I hadn't spent much time here in my life. And my father had already set up LADOL, so I can't take credit for setting it up. So he'd set up this company that had built one warehouse in the middle of the harbor, but it wasn't connected to any land. And the idea was to set up an industrial hub. And he just had this vision based off of 40 years of being involved in various industries and seeing that Nigeria wasn't developing technologically or industrially, that there were massive projects that Nigeria was funding and we weren't getting the benefits. And if you look at what happened in other countries, the closest corollary to Nigeria is probably Malaysia. People often say around the 1960s and 70s, Malaysia, South Korea, Nigeria, we were all about the same level. But somehow they managed to industrialize with fewer natural resources than Nigeria, and they did it by building out massive infrastructure and facilities. So the vision was to build this industrial hub. 20 years later, out of a disused swamp, we have built an industrial hub. Several activities that have never been done in Africa before have taken place in LADOL. We've halved the cost for deep offshore logistics support, which is a very specialized kind of logistics support where you have to operate 24/7. And you've got vessels coming in from offshore, but it's kind of like a Formula One race course where the vessel comes in, it immediately has to be offloaded, you unload the cargo, and it goes out all within 8 hours. So that's an incredibly fast turnaround time. We've actually achieved turnaround times of as little as 2 or 3 hours. But in order to do that, you need to have a lot of infrastructure, facilities, know-how already set up, just like you have in Formula One. When the car comes around the track, they don't go around and go and get the tire off the wall. The tire's already waiting there. The pit crew's already waiting there. Enormously difficult to have all of that set up ready to go when the vessel comes in. So it took us about a decade to get there, building quaysides, warehouses, IT know-how, training up the people. But we got there. And as a result of that, it makes Nigeria much more competitive globally when it comes to doing these massive deep offshore projects. By halving the costs of doing those projects in Nigeria, we are able to compete with other countries, other regions like Latin America for the IO's international investment, which leads to massive job creation. And then we partnered with Samsung. That's been a great collaboration. They have fantastic technology. And because South Korea has been through a similar journey to Nigeria, they really understand what we mean by local content and technology transfer. And so that collaboration led to the creation of SHIMCI, which is the largest vessel fabrication and integration facility in West Africa, and has carried out the largest vessel completion and integration that's ever been done in Africa. It's been really hard, but it's been really tremendous. And I mean, the main benefit for the country we're looking at now is between 30 and 50,000 indirect jobs being created over the next decade.
Thank you so much, Dr. Amy. While you were going through that, two words were ringing in my mind. And one of them is just the amount of innovation that LADOL has stirred up in that region and across the multiple sectors. So we're talking maritime sector, we're talking oil and gas, you're talking technology, just the massive amount of innovation that you have garnered, right? And put into the system in Nigeria. And then the second thing also is competition. The competitiveness of Nigeria has gone up because of all the work that you've been doing. And why those stood out to me is because on this podcast, Business Innovations Around Integrity, we are about making businesses more competitive, making the business environments that businesses in Africa operate in more competitive, and enabling them to be as innovative as they possibly can be by removing barriers that exist in the ecosystem. And one of the catalysts for all of the various kinds of barriers to competition and innovation is corruption and unethical practices and inefficiencies in the regulatory environment. So I want to talk about how you navigated those challenges that you most certainly might have encountered, because if you could tell us off the top of your mind how many regulatory agencies regulate LADOL's operations, I imagine we would all
of them.
Exactly. There you go. And for in the compliance and risk management space, that's already a high risk venture right there, because you're being regulated by multiple government agencies and you're having to interface with many public officials at the same time. And you're trying to do everything you're doing very efficiently. So you need quick turnaround times on everything you're doing. So you need all your licenses in place. You need feedback quickly from the government agencies. So I imagine you've experienced those challenges in the regulatory environment that threaten the innovation that you're trying to instill in your organization, the competitiveness of your business. Talk to us about how you navigated some of the challenges. Any specific stories you want to share would be really insightful for businesses that are dealing with those right now and maybe making the right decision, in some cases not making the right decision. But this is what the pod is about, really helping businesses know how to make the right decision, like you've been doing over the years.
Thank you. So firstly, it's important to say that working in Nigeria in this incredibly difficult space, building infrastructure, dealing with almost all the regulatory agencies, has restored my faith in humanity. It really has. We are not an oil and gas company, but a lot of our clients are oil and gas. And when we came into the market, we were met with a monopoly, a very powerful, very wealthy monopoly. And that is common. When I meet colleagues in similar businesses from Asia, from Malaysia, from Latin America, even from America and Europe, even today, they face the same challenges, which is that an innovative new entrant who is adding tremendous value finds it almost impossible to get access to the market. And the very regulatory environment that is supposed to foster innovation and attract investment into the country is quite often set up to discourage any new entrants or to bar them. I mean, at one point, I was sent a letter by someone in government effectively saying we couldn't do our business. Now, so in that atmosphere, why has my faith in humanity been restored by being in Nigeria? Because Nigeria is a place where not only is it hard to do the right thing, you are punished for doing the right thing. And at every step along the way, we have been scrupulously compliant. And if that meant taking a year to get an approval instead of 1 month, we did it. We did that because that was the philosophy behind the founders and our management, but also because from a business perspective, in an environment like as similar to the one I've just described, the best protection you have as a new entrant is your compliance, is your ability to demonstrate that you've done the right thing, you have all the right signatures, you didn't skip over any desks. That's hard. And one of the ways I think that manifests itself in terms of impact on the management is that, and the shareholders, is that you have to be prepared for the long haul. And doing a business like this, the journey has to give you joy. You have to enjoy going through those processes. You have to enjoy the work you do every day and not focus so much on the end result. And as we're going through those processes, even though the system and some very powerful, small number of powerful people in the system were set up to stop LADOL from existing, the people that we met along the way were just tremendous. You sit down with a civil servant, you explain your business to them, they understand the value, they understand that you're doing the right thing, and more often than not, they will find a way to help you. And it's not easy. There were times where there's one story where I was almost, this was years ago now, don't come for me, but at one point customs did threaten to arrest me. This was way back when, and it was because of the impact of this monopoly that was basically very influential within customs at that time. They no longer are, and they wanted to shut us down, so they threatened to arrest me. So I went to the customs office and I sat there for 10 hours, and they saw me sitting there, and eventually someone will see you and you explain what you're doing, and people will help because fundamentally people are decent. And even in the most difficult circumstance where someone could basically lose their job for doing the correct thing, they often will do the correct thing because of their sense of humanity, sometimes because of their sense of patriotism, and because at their core, I feel like the average Nigerian person wants to live a decent life. And more importantly, they want their family and community to live a decent life. And we all understand that some of the corrupt practices that are so pervasive throughout the world now are inimical to decency, to justice, to people even having a decent quality of life. And so it wasn't personal when a lot of these people were helping us. It was really based off of the fact that they understood that this was an opportunity to do the right thing, and they did it. There will always be shortcuts that are offered to you. The problem with those shortcuts is that, number one, they almost always fail. So if you're taking a shortcut and you're in a situation where it's a one-off contract, you're going to import something and you have a friend who can help you get a waiver. Even if that deal works in the moment, 9 times out of 10, it's going to come back to bite you because the records are there. And so it's very important to remember that even though it's tempting to take these shortcuts, you will never escape the consequences of that action. And even if you do escape the consequences of that action, look around your environment. In fact, look around the world. We all understand the chaos that the world is going through right now. We all understand the inhumanity we're seeing in different parts of Africa, in different parts of the Middle East. Even in Western countries, people are protesting for pensions, they're basically protesting for a living wage. And so by taking the shortcuts that you're tempted to take or that you're offered, you are creating a world where people cannot live with dignity. That's the bottom line. And maybe because in Nigeria, it is so clear, the poverty is so clear, the costs of not doing the right thing are staring all of us in the face all the time. Maybe because of that, I've found that Nigerians are the most decent, the most hardworking, the most ready to take risks, to do the right thing of any community, a group of people that I've worked with.
That's, I don't know if we need to follow that with anything else. I think that that's just a superb message to back up the answer. I was just impressed with the mention of the philosophy of the founders as a very important motivation and thinking about this in terms of the long haul. And I think that's also why you do a lot of work, even outside your primary business organization, that contributes to making business making business contribute to building a better world, right? And I know
Yes.
Tom wants to talk a bit about that. So why don't we now just segue, move away from LADOL in Nigeria and talk a bit about some of the other things you do. And I'd love to, if we have time, come back to continue talking about the inspiring work that you've been doing in Nigeria. So, Tom, we could go on all day, but I think you should get us back on track.
Actually, that was one of the finest descriptions I have ever heard of the effects of the invidiousness of bribery and corruption. So I think we should stay with this. I'm completely blown away. I've for years argued and tried to articulate that crime leads to corruption and leads to terrorism. You have talked about this from the humanity, the human angle, and what it means to the individual, and what it means to when you cheat, there's no such thing as a victimless crime. You may get the benefit from it, but you corrupt someone else. But you've talked about 3, 4, 5, maybe 6 levels of people who were injured or damaged, or infrastructure that was done improperly, or government that didn't run the way it was supposed to be. And yet you brought that all back to us in a way that, frankly, I've not heard someone articulate. So, frankly, Lola, I think we have to stay with this. This is just too great. Let me talk about, see if we can maybe go down an economic tangent, because I really try to advocate. I come out of the energy industry and I see compliance, doing business ethically and in compliance, as a not only a net positive for business, but I say that effective compliance equates to more efficient business processes, equating to greater profitability or greater ROI. I was wondering if you could say a few words about why you might see, if you agree with that, why you might see compliance is actually leading to more efficient business processes to hopefully a better run business.
No, that's a great point. So I would say, and it ties very nicely into sustainability. When people talk about running sustainable businesses, there are two big aspects of it. The first aspect is identifying sustainable business opportunities in healthcare or green energy technology, or just setting up a factory in a more sustainable way, or recycling or something. So the business opportunities are out there. But what makes a sustainable business more successful a lot of the time, are more successful than non-sustainable, is that sustainable businesses tend to be more compliant because they have to be, because you're doing something new, because you're a new entrant, because you're thinking through how to make your business work while you're running your business a lot of the time. And that's something that will naturally happen when you're doing something that's never been done before. So compliance, a lot of people don't understand. What that basically means is a lot of really boring, not boring, laborious, let me say, policies and procedures, work instructions. You have to go into a lot of detail about exactly how things are done. An example from my industry in LADOL, we do a lot of lifts. And when you look at it from the outside, it's like there's something on the quay side, a crane comes along, it picks it up, it puts it on a vessel. There are about 100 steps involved in that. And before the operation even starts, you have what we call a toolbox talk, where you sit down with everybody involved in the operation, you talk about the risks, you talk about every step of it. That needs to be signed off by a compliance person and an HSE person. You then go ahead with the operation. The crane needs to be certified. The people involved need to be certified. The vessel team all need to be coordinated. So there are many different procedures that have to happen. And at its core, what compliance can do in the context that I've just said is save your life. We talk about that in health and safety when we're dealing with offshore logistics all the time. But it also creates a much more robust company. LADOL does 1,000 different things because we're like a small city. But even if your company is just doing one thing, it's just making a better mousetrap, or you're one of these companies making mini solar grids, you need to keep track of your inventory. That's an easy one. You know that. But particularly if you're in a difficult environment, you need to think very carefully about your HR policies and how you're going to get your staff to be motivated, how they're going to be compliant, how you're going to make sure that as your business grows, you can scale up. Because today you're making 1,000 systems. Next year you want to be making 10,000. There's no way you can scale up from 1,000 to 10,000 if you're not compliant. And one way these compliance processes can be codified is through the ISO system, ISO. People hear that and it's very well respected throughout the world. But again, they don't understand that it's a means of codifying all these policies and procedures, and most importantly, tracking continuous improvement. So every year you're continuously improving on how you identify risks, how you identify opportunities, how you keep your staff motivated, how you grow your business and scale it, how you do succession planning. Sustainability cuts through all of this, because sustainability and running a sustainable business is about those processes. Are you measuring your carbon output? Are you measuring how much plastic you're using? Do you have a system in place where if you're in a country like Nigeria, where you're replacing all your air conditioners with renewable or more sustainable versions? Or is there new technology out there that uses less energy but gives you cooler air? In the case of LADOL, we're building a circular economy. And because we have this industrial village, you use the heat from one process to cool in another area. And so if you want to be sustainable, and we should all want to be sustainable because it will lead to higher profitability, then you must be compliant. Because for sustainability to work, you have to track everything. You have to capture that tracking mechanism, and you have to use it to improve your business in 100 different ways. And what you will find is that every year your costs will go down a little bit, your efficiency will increase a little bit, and it will impact your productivity. Because compliant companies tend to have happier employees, not only because you have policies around HR and you think about how you incentivize people, you think about how you hire women, you think about how you increase your diversity. You also create an atmosphere where people can take responsibility. Because a lot of compliance procedures put responsibility into the hands of your staff. They say, okay, this is the procedure. This is how you're supposed to do your job. These are the rules you have to follow. You have to make these rules your own. We also want to see how you can improve upon them. And we want to see how you can use them to lead your peers, to lead your team better. So you're putting the power back into their hands. And I think a few studies have been done that show the number one incentive for workers is actually the sense of responsibility they feel for their job. Money matters, yes, but that sense of responsibility, that sense that this is my project, whether or not this succeeds or not is down to me, is actually the strongest motivator of people. And you can't have that in place in a meaningful way without some level of compliance.
Now I'd like to talk about how being compliant or doing business rather ethically and in compliance can be such a business positive as a potential joint venture partner, as a potential receiver of investment, whether that investment be private equity money, whether it be shares on a public stock exchange, whether it be a business loan from a bank or other financial services. And what I saw in the energy industry was driving compliance all the way down through the supply chain, so that if you wanted to do business with an oil field service company, you had to have a compliance program in place. Could you maybe talk about the business solution of compliance and how businesses are really driving that as well?
Sure. I think it's also good to point out that companies in the energy industry are probably, no, not probably, they are the best placed to drive fast and significant, game-changing sustainability across the world. And I say that because 30, 40, maybe, yeah, 40 years ago at least, the energy industry wasn't super compliant. There were a lot of HSE issues. There were a lot of counting issues. We had monopolies. We had all kinds of things. And I think a lot of the drive for compliance in the energy industry, and I may get this wrong, so please correct me, but I think a lot of the external drivers came from HSE, from health and safety incidents, which attract a lot of attention, or environmental incidents, which attract a lot of attention. But if you look what happened in the energy industry, as they became more compliant, and I would argue now, companies in the energy industry are by far the most compliant in the world. I mean, if you go to a normal port facility and you see their standards, and then you come into an oil and gas or a logistics space, and certainly if you come into a LADOL, it's like night and day, in every direction, from how clean it is, from people wearing protective clothing, all the segregated areas. To be in the energy industry, you have to be super compliant. And so from the top to the bottom, this is an industry that is a perfect example of how compliance can drive profitability and innovation. Because you now have, within the energy industry, companies that have very long-term business models, companies that are investing tens of billions of dollars. I mean, somebody told me yesterday, one of the oil companies is investing $70 billion in a series of projects, not in Nigeria, sadly. But, how many industries have companies that can do that? And although it's not a perfect industry, let's look at it as the glass is half full, that to have one company that can mobilize that kind of funding into these types of projects, I would argue, would not be possible if the industry hadn't so strongly embraced compliance. So if you now want to bring that to a lower level, and you're in a high growth, low income country like Nigeria, and let's say you are in the restaurant industry or even in the transportation industry, and you're trying to attract people to invest, you're now telling people to give you their money to put into your business. And by the way, this 70 billion that this energy company wants to invest, it's not their money. They have to show evidence to someone that they can collect that 70 billion, invest it over 20, 25 years, and give a healthy return. So in the same way, if you're now a small business, you've got to demonstrate the same thing. So you've got to demonstrate your know-how. You've got to demonstrate your ability to execute. You've got to demonstrate your ability to scale. You have to demonstrate your integrity. You can't expect someone to give you their money, even if it's 100 naira, if they're not sure they'll get it back. And compliance is how you do all of that. And the standards of compliance that Nigerian companies have to meet if they're going out into the world, even in Nigeria, are extremely high. They are high. And I have been at the forefront of complaining that the standards of bankability that Nigerian companies are forced to meet to get investment is so prejudiced, it's so unfair. However, The upside of that is that we are much more prepared to succeed when we do get that funding. So it's much harder to get it. You have to demonstrate high levels of compliance. You have to have all your bases covered. But if you have all your bases covered, you are much more likely to succeed and to scale and to grow once you get that money.
Lola, back over to you.
Thanks, Tom. So let's come back to today from talking about your challenges in the early days, which I think was a good thing because it's prepared you for what you're currently doing now, which is what you're doing now, which is not just running this just super impressive business and industrial city, but really inspiring more cities and more leaders around the world to take bold steps like this, right? And just empower their nation in mind-blowing ways. So let's talk about what has changed since when LADOL was handed over to you and you started to build it the way you've been doing. What has changed in Nigeria, in addition to the level of compliance which you've alluded to, which has improved over time? But what has changed now? What will a new entrant experience when they're setting up a business now that they wouldn't experience before? And how can they leverage those, I guess, policy or other sort of changes in the environment for growth? And maybe we'll end it there. I'm looking at the time. I hope we have more time.
Sorry, I'll be quick.
We'll make the exception for you.
Okay, I'll be quick. No, so I'll say the major thing that's changed is actually the regulatory environment to make it easier for new entrants to come into the market. Not just LADOL, other businesses have proven that we need to be competitive internally in order to be competitive externally. So definitely anybody who wants to start a business in Nigeria now, no matter how big or small, will have an easier time than you would have had 20 years ago. I think that the size of the market has obviously increased tremendously. I think that the acceptability of local solutions has increased tremendously. When we started 20 years ago, people didn't really trust that if it was made in Nigeria, people were a little bit like, that's not. But now people are actually seeking out made in Nigeria products. I'm not just talking about in our industry. If you look at, to take a completely off the wall example, but a significant one, you look at Nollywood. But then if you look at the food and beverage industry, if you look at feminine hygiene, if you look at, there are lots of different industries now where made in Nigeria has become a badge of honor. I think it's also important to look at how we have decreased our reliance on international funding. This has been by necessity, but it also helps. We're not there yet. We're still way too reliant on the dollar. We need to invest more in local manufacturing, local services, local know-how, so that our businesses are built on Naira, and those Naira businesses are then going out into the world. So more has to be done, but I think we can pat ourselves on the back for how far we've come. And COVID demonstrated this very well, I think, in how successfully we came through that, despite the fact that we had to rely almost solely on local resources. Right now, the economy is really bad across the world. As I said, you see protests on the streets everywhere. Partly this is because a change is happening, change in generations, change in the global market. I'm a proponent of globalization. I just think you need to do it right. I'm a proponent of capitalism, but the invisible hand has to be respected. Government has to play its role in decreasing inequality. And so I think that in this environment, people are struggling, but they shouldn't give up. And I think they should use this moment, if they can, to become much more self-reliant and to look at what you can do in your community. If you have a job and you're thinking about diversifying into another business, online, manufacturing at home, the food industry, do it in a small way. Don't think that you have to start big. Start by just selling to your neighbors and grow from there. When over the past 21 years at LADOL, our chairman has had a philosophy, which is that, look, even if we don't have any money, let's just do at least 1 meter of development. Some years you develop 1 meter, other years you develop a whole shipyard. But if you do a little bit every year and you make that your lifestyle, you'll look back after 20 years and you'll have achieved something, and you'd have developed a lot of a strong sense of self-worth on the journey.
And we can't, I think, forget to mention that in addition to all of the innovations you described, one of the interesting ones that's the sort of center of this podcast is the ethics first, which really helps the small businesses codify all of the policies and procedures that they may read about on the internet, but just might find too complex to implement. So absolutely right. Lots to learn from all you've said. We hope to bring you back.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
Thanks so much. And Dr. Jadesimi, could you tell us, if our listeners wanted more information on yourself or your company, where would be the best place or places for them to go?
So the easiest is just to go to our website, www.ladol.com, LADOL.com. And from there, you've got links to all our social media and whatnot. We're also on LinkedIn. I think we're on Facebook and Twitter/X.
I wanted to thank you so much for this conversation, and I greatly hope we can continue it.
Thank you. Thanks so much for including me, and thank you for all your great work.